Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program. We would like to thank Rockland Public Library and the Friends of the Rockland Public Library for hosting us and being good citizens for allowing us to be here. The Camden Conference, as many of you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers from our community. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. In keeping with this mission, we offer a series of community events leading up to our annual weekend conference. These free series of community events are intended to provide background on the yearly topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in the three-day format. This year's conference, our 38th, Democracy Under Threat, A Global Perspective, will take place February 21 through 23 this year, 2025, live at the Camden Opera House and streamed to Rockland Strand Theater and Falmouth. For more information on our organization and the 2025 conference, see camdenconference.org. Another bite for you this coming Saturday at Camden Public Library. There'll be another community event presented by Senem Asian, who's a professor of politics at Bates College. It occurs from 2 to 3 p.m. and the topic will be Erdogan's New Turkey Politics of Emotions and Authoritarian Populism. Tonight, however, as a part of our community event series, we are pleased to have Bill Hall, who will discuss with us Ukraine and the survival of democracy in Europe. Bill served as a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer from 1969 to 1999. With extensive deployments across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. A Princeton graduate in politics and a master's degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. He currently serves on the Camden Conference board, where he gets free donuts every so often, and previously led the World Affairs Council of Maine. And Bill resides on Peaks Island. So please help me give a warm welcome to our speaker, Bill Hall.
It's yours. Well, it's really, thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and it's really great to see all these people who turned out this evening on a cold evening here in Rockland. But I really appreciate having an audience in here. The topic was, in particular, I was trying to figure out, well, we're going to talk about democracy at the Camden Conference. And so what could I do in relation to that with my experience in some of the assignments that I had? And I spent a fair amount of time in Central Europe, particularly in Germany, and then also in Eastern Europe. And I said, well, let's think about what's going on in Europe right now, which the big issue, I think, is Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine? And how does that relate to democracy, if you take the Camden Conference theme for this year? So I was trying to put together a talk that would say, well, the title is Ukraine and the Survival of Democracy in Europe. And it's hard to figure out exactly how to approach it, because I've already said that it's really a two-way thing, because Ukraine's survival will have an impact on the strength of democracy in Europe, but the strength of democracy in Europe will also have a big impact on Ukraine's survival. So it's really a two-way. You could deal with it from either side, and I finally ended up trying to deal with it from both. So I'll get to a conclusion, and then I'd love to have some discussion or questions. But what I thought I would do is, as an approach to this, is first, I thought, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about democracy? What is democracy? And I'm sure this is very brief. I'm sure you could go into this discussion for the next 3 days, but to me, it's free and fair elections. Those are elections that are open, people can participate, and they get to express their real opinions about who should be running the government. It's also the rule of law, so you're not making arbitrary decisions that affect or benefit certain individuals. You're acting according to the laws of the country where you live. It's also a country with an independent judiciary. I think that's just critical. You can't have a judiciary that's totally tied to, say, for example, an autocratic leader. Then you really are threatening democracy. It needs a free media. So you need a media that comments on, criticizes when it's appropriate. And I think we've seen some instances lately in our own country where I have some concerns about how free is our media. And I think that's a significant issue for us. And you need a strong civil society. And when I say a strong civil society, I mean you need organizations that are outside the government. They may be nonprofit organizations, for example, but they're strong enough to carry out certain functions the government may carry out, but carry out in partnership with the government, but also may criticize the government when that's appropriate. And I think any society that is really democratic has strong civil society institutions. And I think that's important. When you look at something that's not democratic, almost in every case, if you have an autocratic leader, that leader is going to go after rigging the elections. He's going to, I'm saying he because it's usually he, not always, but he's going to challenge the rule of law because he wants to have whatever he wants without any challenge or any objection from anybody else. He's going to redo the judiciary, and Poland was a great example of this in the 19 teens to 20s, redo the judiciary so it's no longer independent, and he's going to really go after the media and try to disassemble the media or reshape the media in a way that's favorable to the autocrat. And certainly you're going to go after civil society organizations. And one of my favorite phrases is when you have an autocrat dealing with a civil society organization, the attack is almost always, this organization is an agent of a foreign power. Have you ever heard that? That's a great way to go after a civil society organization that is independent from the political leader. So we'll talk about Ukraine in all this sort of context, and we're going to do it by maps. So we're going to map journey, and the map here is Eastern, Central, and Western Europe, and Ukraine being a very large state in Eastern, or I heard it called Central Europe. You have to figure out how you want to call it. I call it Eastern Europe. And then what I'm going to do is, I kept thinking, well, what democracy in Ukraine? Let's look, I said, is there democracy in the hood, the neighborhood? And I said, democracy in the hood, that's the title of my presentation. Well, I changed that. It didn't sound quite right, but hey, I thought it was good. But it is really, I'm going to go on a presentation that's about democracy in the hood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with Ukraine in there, and we're going to go on a map journey, Belarus, Poland. We're going to just kind of sweep around the western side of Ukraine and look at the political situations in those countries. And are they democratic? Are there trends that are going on in those countries? I do feel like if Ukraine had the backing of a firm set of democratic nations, Ukraine's defense, Ukraine's protection of its own sovereignty would be much stronger. So I asked, well, what is the situation right now? Does Ukraine have, if you look at this sort of array right here, does Ukraine have the backing of democratic nations? And I think that's an important question to deal with. So we'll go on a little map journey, and I'm going to start you up north with Poland and Belarus. Belarus directly to the north, and Poland to the northwest of Ukraine. So there are a couple of your neighbors. And to the east, of course, guess what all that yellow is? That's Russia. That's not a friendly neighbor. Belarus is interesting. It's headed by a gentleman by the name of Lukashenko. And Lukashenko started out as a fairly democratic leader. And Belarus was one of the three nations represented in a 1991 vodka-filled dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia participated in a meeting where they decided, with Boris Yeltsin being there, we didn't want a Soviet Union anymore. But Belarus is an interesting case. It's a country where even when Lukashenko finally was in charge, he was probing his own, trying to figure out his own standing. Is he going to be related? How is he going to relate to Russia? How is he going to relate to the European Union, for example? And what he decided was Russia, that his strongest relationship was going to be with Russia. And Russia put some pressure on, as you can imagine, put some pressure on him to decide that way. So Alexander Lukashenko, who's the head of Belarus right now, has decided that he's throwing his lot with Russia. And that meant that when this little confrontation with Ukraine started between Russia and Ukraine, he was going to allow Russian forces and weapon systems to be stationed on Belarusian soil. And they're there now. And they always present a threat to Ukraine. So Ukraine has to consider not only the pressure that's coming from the east, from Russia, dealing with the west, the eastern provinces of Ukraine, but it also has to look a little bit north and say, well, what is going on in Belarus right now? Would Russian troops, supported by Belarusians, maybe not entering actually Ukraine, but supporting the Russians, would they come in from the north and help the Russian troops out? Right now, that hasn't happened, so there hasn't been an incursion from Belarus to Ukraine from the north. Lukashenko, interesting though, there's still the little trace of the West there, because just recently, there was a really, from 2020, there was an election in 2020 for a new leader in Belarus. That Lukashenko claimed it was, he won it. Of course, I don't think he did, but he says he did. And then there were demonstrations that started in 2020 and went into 2021. Quite a few demonstrations and quite large. And Lukashenko, with the help of the Russians, suppressed all those demonstrations. So again, he realizes that his political standing rests on Russian support to a great extent. However, recently he released about 200 dissidents from prison, folks who had been arrested during the demonstrations and put into prison. Some number over 200 of them were recently released, and that led to some speculation. What is he doing? Is he looking at possible different outcomes in Ukraine and considering, does he want to have some favorable standing in the West from doing this? And I don't know the answer to that, but it is interesting that he did release some. There's one key dissident who was really leading the way in that, and he has not released that person yet at all. So that's unfortunate. But again, released quite a few of them just recently. And is he planning to use those as a way to deal with the West? I don't know, but it's a really interesting development. Poland. So if you think about Belarus being the Russian partner, Poland is Russia's antagonist. They have a long history. They really have a long history. So we're going from the partner to the antagonist, and Poland is really an interesting case because it went from, just recently, 2023, new election came in, which kicked out the Law and Justice Party, which had been in power since 2015, ejected them, they lost the election, and now in place, instead of the Law and Justice Party, is a coalition of the center-right. So Poland underwent quite a change in the 2023 election. And in the war, it has become the keystone for the defense of Ukraine. So that is really, if you're looking at who's got my back, Poland really has behaved in a way that shows it has the back of Ukraine during this war with the Russians. It's a keystone for the defense of Ukraine. So much of the supplies from the U.S. and other countries are going through Poland to reach the Ukrainian forces. And it's also been a refuge for Ukrainian civilians. So quite a few civilians who have fled the bombings and the attacks that the Russians have imposed on Ukraine have ended up in Poland. It's interesting, if you look at this reform group that's come in place in 2023, trying to reform the country. There was a really good article in a magazine that I read that's on Eastern Europe, and they said that the current center-right government is having a great deal of trouble reforming things like the judiciary, because it was completely, the Law and Justice Party completely stripped out the judiciary, put in its own set of judges, and now it's a struggle for the new centrist government to try to reform the judiciary. So they're having quite a few challenges, and that includes the legislature. Because right now the center is a coalition government. That means you have to get agreement of a whole lot of parties in order to come up with a majority in parliament. So they're in a struggle, but again, it's quite a change from the days of the Law and Justice Party. And then one more thing I want to note is, just remember, I think you probably remember this from a year or so ago, and a little more than a year ago now, where the Ukrainians were looking for a way to ship grain because the Black Sea ports were blocked. And they shipped a lot of the grain through Poland, which got the Polish farmers upset because they thought that would interfere with their own grain production and also drive down the prices of grain. So that was an issue that was significant, but it hasn't shaken that much Poland's support for Ukraine, which is a good thing. Then we go off a little bit with the map. We're back to the map again. I had more fun with this map, trying to figure out, well, what do I want to show? And today I was playing around with it. I said, I can take a little marker. Well, I didn't really take a real marker. It was a digital marker, and mark these countries. So that's what I was doing this morning before I came up here. But the Czech Republic and Slovakia are two interesting players in this as well. And they have a unified history, right? Because that was Czechoslovakia at one time. And Czechoslovakia split in 1993 into two different nations. And the western side of that is the official name now. They've adopted the name of Czechia, which I think is interesting. You know, if you look at there are a lot of EA countries, right? Bulgaria, Czechia, Slovakia, et cetera, and Czechia is now an EA also. But the Czech Republic still is the name you see most often in the West, but it's officially the government says we are Czechia now. But these two places are really different. When I was in Central Europe, it was really amazing how different the Czech side of Czechoslovakia was from the Slovakian side. Slovakian side tended to be much more conservative, much more rural. The western side, the Czech side, was heavily influenced by Germany and comparatively highly industrialized and modern by compared to the Slovakian side. There's a beautiful picture of Prague, and Czechia, which they like to call themselves now, is quite democratic and has a strong democratic government. The democratic government has been in place for a number of years now, and Czechia has indicated strong support for Ukraine against Russia, so that's good. Nice to have a little backing there. And it benefits from and supports the European Union. And benefits from means it's a good player in the European Union. It gets financial benefits from the European Union, and also gets a lot of benefits from the industrialized society that it's built from various European manufacturers, and particularly back in the days when the Germans came in right after they were actually there before the fall of the wall, but building automobiles in Czechia was a popular thing for German manufacturers. So that is the most democratic, and I would say it's the most supportive, but in a different way from Poland. Poland's support for Russia is because I think they don't like the Russians, and they have such a long and bloody history with the Russians. But this is, I would say, is the most democratic neighbor of Ukraine. This is really interesting because it's so different when you just cross that line and go to Slovakia. There's a very different approach there. There's a far-right Slovak National Party, which has the legislative majority. And really, from the time of the division in 1993 onward, Slovakia has had a very right-wing, I wouldn't even call it center-right, but pretty far-right government. And that's been pretty much the tradition in Slovakia. And the government has vocalized that it opposes further support to Ukraine during this war. And Prime Minister Robert Fico, who's right there on the left with Putin, just visited Putin in December. And what was he there to do? We don't know all the story yet, but one problem that Slovakia has right now is right there at the bottom. Major issue is supply of natural gas. There's a gas transit that comes through Ukraine. Ukraine has recently just not renewed the agreement that they had with Russia to allow Russian gas to flow through the country. And from there, it goes to other places like Slovakia. So I think maybe, perhaps, and this is most likely, Fico was also talking to Putin about how he can get access to energy supplies from Russia. So I think that fits into the Slovakian model of how it wants to deal in its relations. It's been a critic, like Hungary, of the European Union. So Slovakia, I think, more and more is turning toward Russia, but has always been pretty right-wing, rural, not a very pro-European Union country since 1993. And then if you keep going to the south here, the next part of the bordering countries is Hungary. We've all heard a lot about Hungary, haven't we? Heard a lot about Hungary. It's amazing. And Romania and Moldova. And those are interesting places as well. And are they part of the defense of democracy for Ukraine? But unfortunately, not too much. This is Hungary, which I think you could describe Hungary as autocracy's model. And when you look at how to build an autocracy, Viktor Orban is almost everywhere I look as the model of how to do that. And he would do all those things I've already talked about, which just means your independent judiciary goes away. Your elections are manipulated in a way. He has elections, right? So it looks like a democracy, but they're now manipulated in a way that ensures the triumph of Orban's party. And also he's really stripped the media of any independence, and anyone who opposes him, and of course is always complaining. If there are a few survivors left in the media landscape, he's always complaining that if they don't support him, they're agents of a foreign power. And he drove out the Central European University. So the Central European University moved out of Budapest, where it was, to Vienna, where it is today, which is interesting. But again, Viktor Orban, he really has executed, if there's an autocrat's playbook, he's the finest example of somebody who's executing it. Look at the things he did: revised the Constitution, remade the judiciary, attacked civil society organizations, agents of foreign powers, eliminated independent or opposition media, and forced out the European Union. And he opposes aid to Ukraine, urges a ceasefire immediately, which would, with Russia occupying a significant 20% of Ukraine's territory, and negotiations. And he's been close to President Trump for quite some time now. And they're just about good buddies. This one I thought was really interesting. Romania. NATO has put a lot of faith in Romania to be a strong partner for the alliance. And it's interesting what's happening in Romania right now. The political situation is becoming unstable in ways that aren't much in, if you're a fan of the United States or NATO or Western democracies. I think Romania seems to be going in a different direction. But it strongly backed Ukraine. But in the November presidential election, November 2024, which has been invalidated just recently by the Supreme Judicial Court invalidated the election. It was really weird. 1 week they said it was a valid election. The next week they said it wasn't. Their argument for the saying that it wasn't was it was too much Russian interference in the election. And that's been a pattern too in Eastern Europe. Almost always the Russians are players. If there's any kind of election going on, the Russians are significant players. So the Supreme Judicial Court just invalidated the election, which means they will schedule a new one. But it was the result of the election was Calin Georgescu, the picture shown there, emerged as the dominant candidate for president with 23% of the vote. He had the plurality. There were a lot of candidates, as you can imagine, but he had the plurality. And interestingly enough, he was not representing a party. He represented himself. And it was a very right-wing agenda that he proposed. And mostly it was conducted in social media. So it wasn't conducted on television or in the press, but really on the social media. And he ended up with the plurality of the votes there. So we'll see where this is going to go. There was another one, a little bit brighter story, there was a parliamentary election in December, which gave the centrist Social Democrats a plurality, but not a majority. So like in a lot of other parliaments, they're going to have to form a coalition of hopefully friends who will work together to promote what would be a democratic government. And then the populist parties, unfortunately, are running strongly in Romania right now, so they're very close behind these. And again, the one thing that I think is interesting right now is since NATO has really sunk quite a bit of money and time and effort into Romania, it's interesting now that the political stability in Romania is open to question, and the pro-NATO orientation is open to question too. And you wonder why. Well, it's mostly because if you look at the way the voting patterns have gone, it's mostly rural, right? They're mostly the ones who vote against against the Social Democrats, for example. And they're unhappy with what they see, declining living standards. So a poor economy, which is true, Romania's economy is not doing well right now. And they're also unhappy with what they see as corruption. So they look around the government, and what they see is so much corruption that they lose faith in the government. So these right-wing parties are growing for that reason. But now there's some question about the political stability, Western stance of Romania in the future. Will that continue or not? And then there's Moldova. Not very big, right? Pretty small country. And a slice of it is in sort of Russian territory, Transnistria. So there's Moldova, the main country, but there's a piece of it, it's like Georgia, right? The Russians have occupied parts of Georgia. Well, they've occupied Transnistria as well, which is a little slice of Moldova. But the main part of Moldova, it's not a big place, as I said, is mostly pro-European, but only by a squeak. It was really interesting. They had an EU membership referendum, which was a vote held in October, and 50.5% of the voters said, yeah, we want to be a member of the European Union. 49.5% said, no, we don't want to be a member. So very close call. The good news is in a second round presidential election, which was held in October. Also, there's so many elections. I was trying to sort out all these elections. There are elections going on constantly. But anyway, there was a centrist, but Maya Sandu. She is a very strong EU membership supporter, and she won with 55% of the vote. And this is a presidential election, so that was good news for Moldova. And then the one problem that Moldova has too is the same problem that Slovakia has, right, and other places, the Russian gas. So when the gas was cut off, that affected Moldova as well. So right now the Moldovans are trying to figure out, well, where do we get our gas? And what they did was they worked on an arrangement with Romania to have some more access to Romanian electrical power. So that's helped them out to some degree in compensating for the loss of the gas supplies. Interestingly enough, Transnistria, even though Moldova offered Transnistria to be part of this arrangement, Transnistria, in its pro-Russian orientation, declined. So there was an interesting story in the paper the other day about these poor people in Moldova who are living in Transnistria who now have no heat, right? And it's the middle of winter. They have no heat because they've lost their gas supply that was coming in, and they did not, and they said no to participating in the electrical arrangement that Moldova had made with Romania. So there we are. But anyway, it's a mixed picture here in Moldova, and Moldova is really a tiny place. So, but it's nice to have at least some degree of pro-Western orientation when you're looking at Moldova. Then I wanted to go across the sea. So it was a very bumpy ride because it's winter. So I went across the sea, traveling across the Black Sea. The Black Sea can be pretty rough in the winter, and ended up in Georgia. And looking at Georgia, well, what is now I admit, I got a little carried away because it's not in the hood anymore. It's pretty far away, but it's still an interesting story because in Georgia, there was an election held recently about, do we want to be European? Do we want to be Russian? And again, there was an enormous amount of Russian influence through very primarily through social media going on in the election that was held in Georgia. So what happened was the Georgian Dream Party, which right now is the majority party in Georgia and pro-Russian with heavy Russian support, it claimed to win in November parliamentary election. Although it reminds me of the election in Venezuela. Was it really a free election or not? That's one of the signs of democracy. If it's not a free election, you really don't have a democracy. So right now, a lot of the folks who live in Georgia are saying, no, it was not. It was a stolen election. And there have been demonstrations going on in Georgia. But the Georgian Dream Party announced that since it had won the election, according to its own views, right, it was going to suspend the accession talks with the European Union for 3 years. So they've stopped their talks, and Georgia is under tremendous pressure from Russia, as you can imagine, right, to not join the European Union. And so daily demonstrations have followed with a protest of a stolen election, and that's Georgia. And so that was our little trip across the Black Sea, and we quickly returned because it was really, but where did we go? We went westward. Now, it gets, so I went through the hood, right? So all these countries that surround Ukraine, what's their status? And it's a mixed picture, right? You've got the Belarus totally, right now it's really totally Russian, totally, supporting Russia. Then you got Poland, who's kind of the opposite of Belarus. But then and Czechia, but then after that, things get a little shaky, right? When you're going around directly toward the west and then down to the southern tier, the degree of support for Ukraine becomes a little bit shaky. But now we've got all these developments that are going on in Western Europe. If I back off from the immediate neighborhood and go out west to some of the big places, like Germany, for example, we have a coalition that disintegrated in the German parliament, and there will have to be new elections, which will take place in February. So Olaf Scholz lost his Free Democratic Party, which was part of the coalition, and now there's going to be an election where the expectation is, if it's not alternative for Germany, which is really pretty far to the right, then perhaps the Christian Democratic Union will emerge, which is a center-right party, and we'll see. But again, elections will take place in Germany. In France, really interesting story in France, wasn't it? Right after the European Union elections, where all these pro-right parties did really well in the European Union elections, and Macron decided, I'm going to dissolve the parliament, and he did. It was a very sort of a frightening episode because the only way you could the only way you could suppress the Le Pen's party, right, was which is now called the National Rally. The only way you could keep them from becoming the majority, they were threatening to do that, was for all these sort of, I guess I'll call them pro-democratic parties to form a coalition, agree that okay, well, I'll tell you what, we will not run 6 candidates who are pro-democratic, we'll run one in this district. So they split up the districts, and doing all this kind of arrangements that they made and deals that they made, they ended up with a pro-democratic parliament coming into place. But it has dissolved. So it didn't last forever. It dissolved over the budget issues that were, because Macron appointed a prime minister who was rather conservative, tried to push through a budget which was heavily dependent upon cutting social benefits, right? And all of a sudden you have a blow up in Parliament, and that budget does not get approved by Parliament. And the parliamentary coalition that had resulted from all these non-far right parties actually getting together and running as a common sort of force, which was really good news, I thought. This kind of all broke down. So now where are we? We're going to have some kind of new parliamentary coalition. Right now there aren't elections planned right now, but a new parliamentary coalition has got to form. And then in Italy, now, did I misspell her name? Is that an R? It's supposed to be is there an R in Melanie's name? No, I'm looking at that. That didn't look right. But anyway, Melanie, she is an amazing person. She has built a very strong party in Italy now, which is pretty far right. But at the same time, she has played a moderate role when it comes to more global issues. So when it comes to Italian, talking in Italy, it's very pro-right. But then in the global sense, she's become quite a moderate, and she's become a very powerful force in Europe. And she's been not exactly anti-NATO, but at least not, I wouldn't say, well, let me say it's not exactly pro-NATO, but she hasn't been virulently anti-NATO either. In fact, again, at the global level, she's been fairly moderate, but continues to show a great deal of popularity in Europe, in Italy, so which is interesting. And then in the European Union, right-wing parties gained big in the July elections, which are held in July 2024, and a centrist coalition had to form in order to block these right-wing parties from achieving a majority in the European Parliament, which would have certainly been interesting. And then in the United States, of course, we had our election and Donald Trump won. And so if I'm backing off from the immediate neighborhood of Ukraine, there are a lot of things going on in the big places like Germany, France, Italy, European Union, and the United States that are at least open to some degree the question of Ukraine and the survival of democracy in Europe and the survival of Ukraine as an independent nation. This is from Foreign Affairs magazine just recently, and this is a trend in a global trend, democracy on the slide, question mark. And this was the first chart there is the number of what the author called, it's hard to say, autocraticizing countries, right? These are countries that are tending toward or turned into what the author would describe as autocratic. And these are down below that is the democratic countries. And those are the countries that are democratic or trending to be democratic. And as you'll see, I remember when 1999 and, we had when the fall of the wall occurred in 1989, and then after that, we had the gradual 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, and everything looked very promising. There all of a sudden seemed to be democracy was sprouting everywhere. But lately, if you look at that chart, again, depending on how you define democracy, autocracy, but if you look at that chart, it looks like there's been a great deal of turning around from this democratic wave, which was pretty strong for about 10, 15 years, and since has weakened greatly. So what we're seeing now is a different trend. And what does that mean? Well, if I look at Ukraine, going back to Ukraine again, if democracy is weakening, what are Ukraine's chances to preserve its sovereignty? Because democracy is one of the strengths that Ukraine could borrow from other countries to, I think, help its defense. If Russia prevails, what are the consequences for democracy in Europe? So I think those are two very big questions. And I wrote down some thoughts on if Russia wins. I said, I couldn't stop. Anyway, here we go. If Russia wins, I'm assuming that Russia, by winning, I mean it absorbs there are 3 eastern provinces of Ukraine that Russia would absorb, which is about 20% of its territory. I personally don't know why Russia would want them because of all the destruction that's gone on there, the already obsolete industry that was there before, and I think Russia would end up with basically a basket case on its hands. But anyway, it wouldn't be just maybe the transfer of territory. How that territory is described? Is it described as an autonomous region of Russia? I don't know. I don't know what the description would be. Is it become part of Russia directly? I don't know. But anyway, either way, Russia can then have one of the things the Russians do so well is maintaining what they call a frozen conflict, which means it's always, everything is in contention, and the Russian pressure never goes away. So there's a frozen conflict. It's not a live conflict. People aren't shooting each other, but Russia's exercising incredible influence over the destiny of another country. It determines or exercises a veto over Ukrainian political and economic future, which it might get. It gains influence over the Baltic republics, right? And Moldova and Georgia as well. So that might very well be another consequence. It sets limits on the expansion of the European Union and NATO. I'm not done. It kept coming. Encourages extreme right anti-democratic forces in Europe, adds to fractures in the European Union, reduces the influence of the United States in Europe and the world, emboldens, I love these 3, China, Iran, and North Korea. There are probably more. I probably didn't get them all. Those are just buddies of Russia right now. And it boosts autocracy incorporated worldwide. So those are some potential consequences if Russia ends up as the winner of however you define win, but if Russia ends up on top of this and Ukraine loses its sovereignty as an independent nation. So what I invite you to do is to go. I think the conference is going to be very interesting. We're going to talk about democracy, and we have some very interesting speakers coming up. This is February 21 to 23, and I think we're going to be going over issues like this. I mean, it won't be centered on Ukraine because we're really going to be dealing with global issues, but looking at issues of democracy and what's going on in the world, it's related to democracy. And we'll even talk about in that context the United States as well, because I think that's got to be part of the discussion. So that's it. So what I've got for a picture for Ukraine is a country that is under attack right now, has neighbors who are getting to some degree either hostile like Belarus or shaky or getting shakier. So it's really not a strong, what I would consider a strong backing for the existence of democracy or democracy as a sort of a good backing for the continued existence of Ukraine as an independent country. It's all open to question right now. And I think the United States is going to be interesting to see what the United States role is going to be in all of this. How is President-elect Trump has said he's going to solve the Ukrainian war in one day. The first day he's there, it's going to be all solved. So we'll see how that goes. But I think there are an awful lot of questions related to the future of Ukraine, and that's all tied in with the future of democracy in Europe. So that's my presentation. It's all really, I think it was fascinating to see what's going on in Europe right now. It's all up for grabs. So, okay. Yeah, thank you. So any questions? Yes.
Thanks. Depending how the war gets resolved, assuming that it gets resolved, what kind of government do you see emerging in Ukraine? I mean, right now, technically, it's a democracy, but it's a democracy under martial law.
Right.
So it's not really a democracy there now. What will it be after?
That's I don't know. I don't know what kind of government it would be. It depends on how it's all resolved, but perhaps it would be a government that is I would say more neutral than anything else. In other words, not obviously leaning toward pro-European Union, pro-NATO, and then a government that is hopefully not a military government because hopefully doesn't need to continue active defense of its territory. But it's really a good, I don't know, I'm not sure what kind of government would emerge there. But it would be interesting to see, the institutions that Ukraine has expressed an interest in joining the European Union and NATO, would that even be a possibility anymore? Or would they be neutralized in the sense that they would have some, and I think you've got to have, for this government to exist, I think you've got to have some kind of, and I hate to call it a guarantee, but you've got to have some kind of assurance from somebody else, not Russia, obviously, who would help, who would say that we would act to protect the independence, the continued independence of Ukraine. But I'm not sure how much faith I would put into that at this point. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of government would emerge. But right now, it's not, the Ukrainian government, you're right, is really pretty much under martial law at the moment. So hopefully that would go away, but what would happen is to replace it, I don't know. So, yes, any other questions? Yep. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I really like the way that you stacked up the neighbors and analyzed it through a democracy lens. Of course, there are other neighbors in the European Union
Right.
who are very pro-Ukraine, pro-democracy, the Scandinavians, the Baltics, and then there's Great Britain, not in the EU, but also very pro-Ukraine right now. So I'm wondering if there is, as shaky as it looks from your map, more of a balance, and it's still holding in Ukraine's favor. So as they go into some kind of negotiation, whenever that might emerge, and I think that's what Trump will be pushing very hard for, will there be enough support, enough of a consensus within the European Union to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty as a democracy?
I think so. I think so, and that's only because it really is different. If you look at Sweden and Finland joining NATO, I mean, they were seriously concerned by this, and they are strong defenders of Ukraine's continued existence, obviously. And the Baltic states are very worried about what happens to us if the Russians get what they want from Ukraine, then what happens to our continued independence. They're very, very worried about it. And Great Britain has been a strong supporter of Ukraine. And I think there's probably enough support right now and again, I really think it keeps coming back to President-elect Trump, though. Where is he going to go with this? If he solves it in a day, I don't know exactly what that means. I think a lot of it depends on the United States and what happens in our own country. So,
can I just comment on that point? I've been thinking about his comments lately about things like Greenland and the Panama Canal, and seeing some work going on, some out of line thinking perhaps, that looks to me like a spheres of interest type of regional hegemony approach. And that would very much favor Putin in Russia, that he will get what he wants, Trump wants the hemisphere back under his domain, China, push out China, and then we let Taiwan on its own. You know, you can imagine a future in which this is all going to fall apart. And I think that might be behind some of his rhetoric.
That's a really interesting thought. Very interesting.
I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Very much so.
But that's a very interesting thought. So I have this vision of Europe dominated by, well, at least up to a point, dominated by Russia. Russia feeling like, okay, Central Asia, Europe, up to a point, that's mine, and Americans aren't going to interfere. And then you've got America, and now strengthened America, right? Greenland included, et cetera. And now America saying, okay, everything's off limits to us. We're going to be happy here. We don't need to go anywhere else. And then you maybe got China. I don't know how you deal with China, because China wants the whole of the South China Sea. And how you deal with that, I'm not really sure. But it's interesting to think about three big countries having this sort of independent authority over a large piece of the earth, at least not including Africa, which is up for grabs for anybody. Yeah, it's an interesting concept. But you're right. He may be thinking totally of a very enhanced Monroe Doctrine.
Exactly. Well, they were very explicit about
Yep.
that in the first
Yeah.
Trump administration. No, there was no hiding that.
Right.
We need a return to the Monroe Doctrine,
Mhm.
and so that's what I think we're headed for.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Good. Yes. Question in the back.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of comments. You were doing your map of the neighborhood. You didn't talk about Russia, and I think that I think one of the key dynamics in this entire discussion is where's Russia today, and do they have the staying power? Because I think one of the things you were talking about, it seemed to be an implicit discussion that Russia's going to win. I think the discussion that we need to be having here is what happens when Russia implodes. And I think you can say the same thing about Belarus. I think when you talk to people in the region and you look at those three countries, which are all Slavic culturally, right? The languages are almost identical. There's this massive shared Russian Orthodox culture. I think a lot of people in the region feel like the weak link there is Belarus, and that may be the first regime to collapse. The second regime to collapse may be Russia, and the regime that may be left standing is Ukraine. So I think that's a really interesting discussion. I think another point that didn't come up that I thought should come up is when you get into energy politics and you talk about that. You talked a little bit about the pipelines being shut off.
Right.
You talked about the implications for Transnistria, for Moldova. What's also really interesting is that the Russians have been shut out of the natural gas market in Europe, right?
Right.
I think it was Gazprom had just had losses for the first time in 20 years as a result of everything that's going on. There's been a huge geopolitical shift in terms of liquefied natural gas going into Europe, and I think that's a really important point. It's a dynamic that needs to be discussed. The other thing too is if you take a step back about Europe, you went country to country. But I think I just read a statistic. They said about 20 years ago, the economy of the European Union and the US were roughly equivalent. And today, the U.S. economy dwarfs Europe. And so I think the other thing that's been going on over the last 20 years, when you look at Europe writ large, is Europe is just much weaker today in total. And you look at with Britain going out of the European Union. So I think there's a huge weakness there that I think is really important. The last point that I thought was interesting that I don't think we've touched on is you're talking about democracy. And I think you have to ask the question, how has this war impacted, there was a question there about martial law in Ukraine. But the other thing is that how has this war impacted Ukrainians? The other thing is that you see, a huge swath of Ukraine used to be Russian speaking. Almost the entire country has switched over and started speaking Ukrainian in parts that historically haven't ever spoken Ukrainian before. So I think that even if Russia ends up winning and you freeze the conflict where it is today, there's still a country that has where it used to be, it's like the Russian Ukraine is Canada and the US, right? And most Ukrainians hate Russia today. Absolutely hate it. And I think Russia's lost this war regardless of what happens. And I think that's it. I think it's a really important point that needs to be talked about. And the last thing, when you're talking about security structures, I thought you were going to talk about Guam, which is Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Moldova. Because when I look at geopolitics in the region, and you talked about the difference between Romania and Moldova, the big difference is that Romania is in the European Union, Bulgaria is in the European Union, and they're both also in NATO. Moldova's not, Ukraine's not, Georgia's not, Azerbaijan's not. And I think that's what's up for grabs today, because the borders have been solidified in a lot of respects, and it's these borderland countries. We have to remember that Ukraine's name in Ukrainian means borderland.
Right.
And so I think that's where the fight is today. So I think there's a lot here to talk about, but I really think, I just want to throw that out.
I think you threw out a lot, and I hope you're coming to the conference. No, I think that was fascinating. I think that was very interesting discussion. And I think the future of Russia is really interesting item to think about right now. It's really remarkable how the Russians have almost politically disengaged from the war. In other words, they don't question the war. There's not a surge of patriotism. At least this is what I'm reading. I don't have direct experience in this. There's not a surge of patriotism in Russia about the war, but they are willing to put up with it. And they have a long history of being not involved in their own government very deeply. They have revolutions periodically, but other than that, they are fairly stoic, accepting population. And right now and it's interesting because somebody said, well, what 25 years of, I think this would be fascinating. How has Russia changed since Putin, right? I think that'd be a very interesting study. And one of the comments was that, yeah, Russia's got a lot of problems right now. The gas delivery, they have to sneak oil out of the country on these hidden tankers, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And Putin hasn't really improved their economy in any way, but the Russians are accepting of but when they asked the Russians this question, are you better off 25 years? Almost everyone said yes. And I don't think they were saying it because they had a gun at their back. I think they were saying because they actually believed it. They actually believe they're better off today, which I thought was an interesting answer. And of course, one of the reasons was if you look at Russia in 2000, it was a chaos. It was absolute chaos. And now to the Russians, it's stable. It may not be terribly successful. It may not be bringing them wealth, but it sort of works. And that's good enough for them. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Just two more comments. I think your comment about are Russians better off today, I think that might have been applied pre-war. I look at if I'm doing a forward analysis and I'm looking at the Russian economy today, I'm looking at two statistics. The one is that the discount rate for the Russian Reserve Bank is 21% today.
Right.
That's high enough to shut the economy down. And you look at the comments that are coming in from Russian business, they are becoming vocal and about claiming that the economy is about to collapse. So I think that's issue number one. Issue number two is inflation. They're running the official Russian government inflation statistics are running 9% right now, something like that. That's when the price of eggs and other things starts to become so expensive that creates popular unrest. So I think that's why I think when I do my analysis of this region right now, I see Russia fraying. And I think the wheels are about to come off. And I think that's what we need. And so to me, it's a staying contest. I think I think that the analysis needs to be forward-looking on economics in Russia right now. I think that's where the play is.
Yeah, that's really interesting discussion. I appreciate that. I think that's a very interesting perspective. I have one thing to say about Ukraine and whether the Ukrainians are Russians or not. And that is, I read a book written in 1946. It's a memoir of somebody, an American named John Fisher. And he worked with the UN Refugee and Recovery Agency. And this is 1946, and he worked in Ukraine. And what he was doing was trying to help these countries recover from World War II, basically. And all these people have become refugees. Where do they go? They go back to their own country. They want to go somewhere else. They don't want to. The Jews didn't want to go back to Ukraine or Poland. They wanted to go. A lot of them wanted to go to Palestine. So he's dealing with all these issues that keep coming up. And John Fisher writes that the Ukrainians want me to speak Ukrainian. They demand everybody speak Ukrainian. And they are so independent and so cantankerous when it comes to dealing with the Russians. It's really incredible. I read this, and this is 1946. This is Ukrainians expressing their own desires for independence from Russia with an expression about their language, expression about everything that relates to identifying Ukraine as a separate country, even though it wasn't. It was really going to be part of the Soviet Union, just like it had been. So very interesting. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. But I'm noticing it's 7:30. Can we do about one more question? Does anybody have another question?
There's one on Zoom that I really wanted to read for you. Oh my goodness, I just lost it. Let's see. We currently have 29, but it was as high as 34 at the highest, I think.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, V had a question in the chat. Do you have
Yeah.
do you have an explanation for the turn to the right of so many of Ukraine's neighbors?
Interesting. That is a really good question. And there's a really great article by a guy named Larry Diamond in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs. And he talks about why are so many countries going to right-wing flavored governments? Why are they turning against democracy? And he gives a lot of different answers, but there are a bunch of them. One is the 2008 financial crisis. The other one is the growing inequality. It's occurring everywhere, but particular how elites are gaining power, influence, and money that aren't being delivered to the middle class or the lower class, working class. So it's really interesting to read that kind of, and a lot of other things that are going on in countries where the population is becoming disappointed with what they see, and they don't see the kind of economic success coming to them. And there's also the pressure of immigration, and whether you're going to have a large population coming into your country from somewhere else who threaten the status of you as maybe completely psychological, but maybe threaten your personal sense of status in your own country. And that has an influence on it as well. So a lot of different reasons for this, but I think clearly there is a decline of the strength of democracies throughout the world right now. I think there are a lot of different answers to that question. So there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jen, do you want to do one more?
Yeah. What we're hearing, at least what I've been hearing about where Ukraine is right now, we are giving support. Are any of these countries that we're talking about, Poland is giving physical support, you know, with taking in the refugees, et cetera. Are any of the other ones that are more pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia, giving any financial support? Is there money on the barrelhead in terms of their strong support for Ukraine, or do you think that's?
Yeah, I don't know about financial support very much.
Yeah.
I know that Britain has been a big supporter in
Yeah.
terms of weapon systems, might
Yeah.
include some financial support as well.
Yeah,
Poland has been a good supporter, but it's maybe more on the receiving end than the giving end.
right.
And then the new members of NATO are very interested in helping out
Right.
Ukraine as well.
So-
Sweden, Finland, the Baltic republics, right? Yeah,
That's what I
coming
was-
through the
yeah, I
European
was
Union,
wondering. So-
exactly, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yes.
not that's what I was just wondering, are any
Right.
of them individually?
Yeah.
Or is it
And
just the-
Germany has been a big supporter as well,
Right.
so
So,
significantly.
My other question, when you first started with Belarus, you know, they were obviously allowing Russia to come in and leave the forces there in preparation for their incursion. But why did Belarus not ever enter? I mean, they seem so solidly Russian.
Mhm.
Why did they never enter into as a partner in the battle? There was a threat at one point early on that I had heard
Yeah.
that they were going to
Yeah.
also support.
There was a threat, right?
Yeah.
But I don't
they
think
didn't.
they felt like they would, I don't think Lukashenko calculated that that would be of benefit to him personally.
Yeah, hedging
Yeah.
your bets.
To
Yeah.
have have casualties and stress his military and things like that. I don't think he felt like there was a benefit that he could calculate from that.
Yeah.
So. Ah,
And the people. Right.
yeah.
If you think about Belarus, most Belarusians used to go down to Crimea for vacation. And so there's a huge, between the populations, they're cousins. The Belarusians don't want to attack Ukraine. They never did. They've been against the war. And that's why Lukashenko stayed out. If he'd gone into the war, his government would have collapsed.
Yeah, interesting. So comment was that Lukashenko the government in Belarus would have collapsed if he had gone into the war actively with military forces. So interesting comment.
So is that why Russia ends up turning to soldiers from North Korea and money and drones and weapons from China?
Yeah,
So they're coming in. Nobody else in the area is supporting the Russian
not
side.
too much.
Okay.
No, really not.
What?
Yeah, right,
Drones
exactly.
from Turkey.
Yeah.
Well, of course.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Russia just took a huge hit in Syria. They've just taken
Yeah.
a huge hit in Transnistria. That's a really big thing. And I think also it goes back to the point that I was making before about Russia is a paper tiger today.
Yeah.
Why are they having to reach out to North Korea for troops?
Exactly.
They've exhausted
Mhm.
the troops that they have in the country. Folks don't want to fight anymore, despite the fact that they're having to pay huge bonuses to people to go
Right.
into combat. They don't have enough prisoners who are even willing to fight.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, as this thing drags out another 6 months or 12 months, I think you have to ask the question, how does it play out? I don't
I've got to meet you again in 6 months.
Right.
No, this is really interesting comments about Russia. I think is absolutely fascinating because Russia may be basically at the losing end of this whole campaign. But again, turning to North Korea, I think for the same reasons you already mentioned, which is they need soldiers.
They need soldiers.
They need soldiers. Yep. Hmm. Yeah, interesting.
Well,
Yep.
except Ukraine is having a problem with manpower.
Oh, yeah, Ukraine is
So
also.
they
right,
have the same
exactly.
weaknesses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ukraine really doesn't have a chance to go. NATO
Yep.
partners aren't going to support
It is
them.
interesting because we're all aging societies with low birth rates, and people don't want to fight wars. I mean, that's what you would hope, but, yeah. So,
when you talk about the Ukrainians drafting folks into the military, hugely controversial issue
Right.
internally right now. But it's also a demographic issue because if you look at it, what happened
Yeah.
when the economies were falling apart. And so you have a gap in the demographically, you have a gap, and the Ukrainians don't want to draft, there's like 18 to 25-year-olds, they don't want, that's the gap. And if they throw those kids into the fight, their demographics can really be messed up. There was a demographic report that came out on Russia, I think last week or the week before, where they're saying that at the rate they're going, the country could be extinct by 20.
It is amazing. The demographics, really demographics is everything. Look at the demographics worldwide right now. It's fascinating. Africa is the only country that's really growing, really. Russia is expected to decline in population by 500,000 this year. Isn't that amazing? That's just stunning. So, yeah.
If you look at demographics, just take the Russian-Siberian border, and you have, I think, 5 million Russians in all of Siberia, which is a huge chunk of Russia. Then you have, I don't know, 50 million or 200 million Chinese on the other side of the border. So on one side of the border, you have all these people, no resources. On the other side of the border, you have all these resources, no people. And how do you think that plays out?
Resources and no people. That's a great way to end, I think. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your coming out tonight. My pleasure, and the great questions. Yeah.